Chapter 6. Scott's first thought was that he was dead. The blue field had electrocuted him, vaporized him, or otherwise turned him into wet dog food. His only hope was that he hadn't also managed to take out Michael and the other students as well. Instead of going on summer vacation, they would all be, never doing anything ever again. With his luck, he would wake up in the afterlife and find a group of very pissed-off young people, all of whom wanted nothing more than to kick his ass for eternity for having been so careless and stupid. But he didn't feel dead. His heart was pounding, and his lungs were moving air in and out in terrified gasps. His skin tingled, feeling as though his body were crawling with 1 billion tiny bugs. He caught a foul whiff of ozone that clung heavy in the air, and figured that surely wouldn't have followed him into the hereafter. His ears were also still working, filled with the loud hum of... was that machinery? The only thing not working correctly were his eyes, but he quickly realized that was because they were squeezed tight in terror. As he slowly opened them, he found he was surrounded by a bright, shimmering blue light that hung about him like a mist. Then the voice came. "Mein Gott!" it said, obviously surprised. "Was ist das?" Scott was fairly certain it was the same male voice he'd heard the night before, though now it was clearer, much closer. It called out, "Schalte das aus!" Scott had no idea what the words meant, or even who they'd been directed towards, but when he looked in the direction from which they came, he was shocked to find the blurry outlines of people. The forms all seemed to be frantically working, with the sounds of buttons being pushed, levers being thrown, and switches being flipped. The loud hum began to wane, and the blue light slowly subsided like a dissipating fog. When it was gone, Scott blinked and tried to look around, his eyes having a difficult time recovering. He was relieved to find Michael standing beside him, still very much alive, and apparently just as panic-stricken. Also standing close by were the other students, the blonde girl, the pudgy boy, the athletic Hispanic, the black male, a skinny skater type, and a wild-eyed young man with a Confederate flag tattoo on his forearm, all seemingly unharmed, thankfully. Like Scott, they were dumbfounded, struggling to comprehend what had just happened in their formerly quiet little computer lab. Only it wasn't the computer lab. Scott looked around in shock. This room, whatever it was much larger than the classroom. It was also quite warm, with large fans blowing the hot air around. It had a tall ceiling with thick cables that snaked down to a floor crammed with hundreds of metal cabinets, on which sat endless rows of glowing, pulsating vacuum tubes. Vacuum tubes? Scott thought idly. Who uses vacuum tubes anymore? In the middle of it all, he saw the stunned faces of 5 older men gawking at him over some kind of control console. Dimly illuminated by the undulating light, their stunned faces resembled a row of owls as they stared wide-eyed and unblinking. His brain struggled to come up with some kind of rational explanation as to who they might be and what had happened. He decided the loop must have caused some kind of explosion or reaction that made him and the others black out, and now they were waking up in another part of the school. These men were probably firemen or paramedics who came to rescue them from whatever disaster he had caused. Or maybe they were faculty, come to see what idiot had blown up their computer lab. Only they didn't look like firemen, paramedics, or faculty. "Mach das Licht an," one of the men said. A moment later, bright incandescent bulbs clicked on overhead, making Scott blink as it revealed the room more fully. The men behind the cabinet were definitely older, none younger than 50. All were white. One of them, a thin man wearing bifocals, slowly stepped out from behind the panel to take a cautious step forward. He wore a suit and bow tie that Scott thought looked to be a style from Walter's bygone era. Like Scott, he appeared to be trying to work out just what the heck was going on. "Wer bist du?" the man asked softly. Scott looked around at the other students to see if anyone had any idea of what he had said. Nobody did. Finally, the boy with the tattoo piped up and said in a rich southern accent, "Sorry, fella, we don't speak gibberish. Y'all speak English?" The man began to reply, when suddenly another man abruptly stepped out from behind the console. Unlike the other, his movements were rigid, his back ramrod straight. He wore a light gray uniform that gave the appearance of being a soldier or a policeman. The design seemed familiar to Scott, though his overtaxed mind was such a whirlwind he couldn't readily place it. The man's face was hard and firm as he glared at the youths. "English?" the uniformed man asked. The tone of his voice was almost accusing. "Yeah," the southern boy said. "What's the matter? Don't y'all speak American?" This only seemed to anger the man even more. He stiffened, and his eyes narrowed as he growled, "Amerikanisch?" "Damn straight," the southern young man said. Then he puffed out his chest and proudly declared, "Red, white, and blue, through and through." The soldier scowled, then turned to the thin man and barked, "Lass sie nicht gehen." The man nodded submissively, and the uniformed man abruptly wheeled around to march out the nearest door. Scott had no idea what was happening, but judging from the man's demeanor, it couldn't be anything good. After making sure the uniformed man was indeed gone, the thin man took another step closer and looked the group over with great trepidation. "Who are you?" he asked softly. So, he spoke English after all. Scott looked at him defensively. "Who are you?" The man nodded obligingly. "I am Professor Erich Seifert. Now, please, where did you come from?" The question took Scott off guard. Where did they come from? Was this guy for real? "The computer lab," he said, as if the answer should be obvious. Seifert's eyebrows only furrowed, deeply puzzled. "What kind of lab?" "Computer lab," Scott repeated. "At the college?" Seifert only continued to stare at him, as if he had no clue what he was talking about, so Scott added, "Heinlein Scientech? D.C.?" Seifert's eyes suddenly widened in surprise. "Washington, D.C.? "Yeah," Scott said. "Where else?" The men behind Seifert began to exchange nervous whispers, and he silenced them with a raised hand. Then he turned back to Scott, looking gravely concerned. These strange children, who wore strange clothing with pictures on them, spoke English and proclaimed themselves to be Americans from Washington, D.C., didn't seem to realize the situation they were in. "But how did you get here?" Seifert asked. Scott only shrugged. "You tell me. I don't even know where here is. Where are we?" Seifert began to answer when the young black man suddenly spoke up. "Hold up," he said, looking quite annoyed. "I get what's going on here." He cocked his head and sneered as he looked to the others. "We're getting played." It took a moment to sink in, but the other students all began to grin, visibly relieved. Of course! That explained everything. This was just some elaborate prank. All around the room there were probably a dozen GoPros pointed at them, and by tonight they would find themselves plastered all over YouTube. A couple of them laughed nervously. The girl reached into her bra, pulled out a cell phone, and held it up high for a selfie with Seifert in the background. Beside her, the pudgy boy unslung his backpack and let it thump to the floor. Still looking quite pale, he grumbled something about how people shouldn't play tricks on someone with his conditions. He dug through a side pocket, withdrew an inhaler, and took a deep shot. "Guys," Scott said, knowing full well that nothing about this was a prank. "I don't know what's going on, but Believe me, nobody's playing a joke. Guys, the girl objected, you want to try being a little more gender neutral there? The black youth only turned back to Seyfert, still looking greatly irritated. Look here, Professor Proton. I'm not falling for this, so you can just turn off the cameras and pack up the smoke machines because I have better things to do with my time. Understand? Bruh, Michael pleaded. This really isn't a prank. Don't bruh me, he shot back. We ain't related, and don't think I don't remember it was you two setting up the light show in the back of the room. But it's not a prank, Scott said. Wait, the skater said, now looking doubtful. If it's a joke, how did we get here? Look, the black youth said, all I know is I'm getting salty AF and am about to go Jackie Chan on someone if they don't show me the exit. Yeah, the southern boy said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Because that'll solve everything. The black youth glared at him sharply, but he only grinned back. This has to be a joke, the girl said, though she too now looked unsure. Doesn't it? One by one, the youths began to convey their reasons for believing their predicament was a hoax or not, but instead of listening, only spoke over one another. Soon they were bickering loudly, and a few insults began to fly. Seyfert could only stare in astonishment at such bizarre behavior until he finally held up his hands to try and get their attention. Silence, he begged. Please. The arguing only continued, however, right up until the time a door flew open and the uniformed man came marching back in. He was now accompanied by 4 other soldiers, who the youths were shocked to see were carrying submachine guns. The students immediately fell silent and stared in surprise as they marched across the room toward them. The pudgy boy let out a squeak and quickly fell to the ground. He mumbled something about Germans under his breath and frantically began digging through his backpack. This time, he produced a small canister of pepper spray and fumbled with the safety release. In his panic, however, he succeeded only in dropping it and watched helplessly as it rolled across the tiled floor to come to a rest by Scott's shoe. Scott didn't notice. His eyes, like everyone else's, were firmly fixed on the approaching soldiers and their menacing guns. As they neared, he was shocked to realize why the uniforms looked so familiar. He'd seen them countless times before in his video games. They were the uniforms of World War II-era German soldiers. Even more terrifying were the weapons they carried, which he also recognized from his games as being MP-40 submachine guns. Relatively short machine pistols, they held a bottom-fed magazine of 32 9mm bullets that could shred most anything in front of the barrel. This had to be a bad dream. World War II German soldiers carrying World War II German weapons? What the hell was going on? Hold up, the skater asked, incredulous. Are those supposed to be Nazis? Before anyone could answer, the soldiers approached and moved Seyfert aside. Then they stepped in front of the youths and raised their guns, which made the students gasp in shock. If this was a joke, it had just gone much too far. Hände hoch! Yelled a soldier. When no one moved, he repeated the instructions in deeply accented English. Hands up! Scott and Michael quickly raised their hands. A few of the other students slowly followed their lead, their confidence that the whole thing being a hoax starting to wane. The southern boy and the black male did not raise their hands, however, and only stared at the soldiers defiantly. Hey, Augustus Gloop, the southern boy said. Didn't your daddy ever teach you not to point guns at people? The soldier only raised the muzzle to point it directly at his face. Out of pure reflex, the boy reached up and grabbed the barrel to shove it away. This action made the soldier squeeze the trigger, and the gun discharged, filling the room with the deafening roar of automatic gunfire. Pandemonium erupted as bullets flew in all directions, shattering glass bulbs and striking machinery with loud metallic clanks. The youths screamed in alarm and dropped for the floor. The soldiers began to shout in German. The older men behind the consoles all made a hasty run for the exit. Only Seifert remained behind, quickly leaping behind a metal cabinet for cover. "Hol auf the Schuben!" the German commander yelled. The soldier let off the trigger and the shooting abruptly stopped. He gave the gun a violent twist to wrest it free from the Southern boy's grasp. They locked eyes, the German with anger and outrage, while the Southern boy stared back in utter disbelief and horror. He had felt the concussions of the explosions, the burning heat of the barrel in his hand, and the cracking of the bullets as they blasted by mere inches from his face. His brain struggled to comprehend that not only was the gun real, but someone had just shot it at him. The soldier shouted at him in German, words he could not have understood even if his ears had not been temporarily deafened by the cacophony. He only stared in shock until another soldier stepped forward and abruptly slammed the butt of his rifle into the side of his head. The boy's head snapped sideways, and he staggered backwards a few steps before stumbling and falling to the ground. He looked dazed as a trickle of blood slid down the side of his face, leaving a red trail that zigzagged down his cheek. The Germans stepped closer in a semicircle, all pointing their weapons at him and yelling for him to stand up. Now fully and painfully convinced this was no joke, the other youths stared in shock and disbelief. The Hispanic athlete and the black male, both suddenly motivated by terror and fueled by adrenaline, saw that the soldiers' attentions were focused elsewhere and quickly took advantage. The athlete swung a fist with lightning speed at the soldier closest to him, striking the side of his face so hard there was an audible thud. The soldier sank to the floor almost gracefully, knocked cold as his gun clattered beside him. At the same time, the black youth slammed an elbow into the nose of the soldier nearest him. The German's nose cracked, and blood began to pour as though a faucet had been turned on somewhere inside his head. He stood momentarily stunned, and the young man abruptly wrenched the gun from his hands. Turning it around, he grabbed the handle and squeezed the trigger. The gun erupted in explosions and began to buck wildly in his hands. Being unfamiliar with how to operate a fully automatic weapon, however, the muzzle climbed with each shot, spraying copper and lead to drill holes in the ceiling. Now unarmed and being fired at by his own weapon, the soldier quickly bolted away, hands covering his head as he ran out the door. The three remaining Germans all quickly ducked behind metal cabinets for cover. The commander withdrew his sidearm, a P08 Luger pistol, and waved it around as he shouted orders at his men in German. They began to fire over the tops of the metal cabinets, their shots pinging and zinging around the room as they struck brick, metal, glass, wood, and copper wire. One of the rounds ricocheted off a thick piece of metal and struck the skater in the arm. He yelped in pain and cradled his bicep, which began to bleed through his fingers. The athlete and the black youth also leapt for cover, firing blindly as they ducked. Their shots raked the glass tubes above the Germans, making them duck as they were showered with bits of glass fragments. Scott, too, was crouched behind a cabinet, arms wrapped tightly over his head. Never in his life had he been so terrified. All around him were explosions and lead bullets that popped the air. He'd only ever heard simulated gunfire before, in the rich 3D stereo of his gaming headphones. It was nothing compared to this. He could actually feel the concussions reverberate through the air. He was astounded at the speed in which the metal projectiles flew, how overwhelmingly destructive they were when they slammed into whatever happened to be in their path. He just couldn't believe this was happening, and for a moment was sure his bladder was about to let loose in fear. His panicked eyes darted about, looking for some avenue of escape. He had no idea where he would even run. All he knew was he needed, to get as far away from all this as possible. He was still looking for a way out when he spotted the can of pepper spray lying nearby on the floor. He stretched out his leg and managed to slide the canister back towards him. He grabbed it and quickly manipulated the safety valve to the ready position. Peering around the side of the metal cabinet, he spotted one of the 3 German soldiers hiding behind cover a few yards away. The man was paying scant attention to him or the others, his focus squarely on the 2 youths with the machine guns. Scott raised the pepper spray, pointed it, and depressed the button. A stream of orange fluid jetted forth, which Scott managed to arc and direct until it began to rain down on the German. At first, the soldier was confused, thinking the liquid must be blood. He wiped it from his cheek and looked at his hand, relieved that it wasn't. Then, his face gradually began to contort as the searing pain set in. His eyes closed involuntarily, and he began to scream in agony as the burning sensation engulfed his face. He let his gun fall and frantically began to wipe at his eyes, as though he might somehow gouge the fire out of them. His attempts were futile, however, and when he could finally tolerate the incredible pain no longer, he ran screaming out the door. Despite the overwhelming feeling of terror, Scott couldn't help but grin. He had just pepper-sprayed a Nazi soldier, and there was something inherently amusing about that. The remaining soldier continued to fire his MP-40 until his second magazine ran out of bullets. Nearby, his commanding officer fired his pistol until the slide locked back, indicating that he too was out. They exchanged concerned glances, knowing they were in desperate need of both ammunition and reinforcements. The commander cursed, deeply frustrated, but knew he could not fulfill his duties if he were dead. He motioned for the enlisted man to retreat, and together they both made a mad dash for the door. After they left, the room fell into an odd silence. Nobody spoke or moved, too frightened to do either. Only the skater made noise, groaning as he cradled his bleeding arm. Finally, after several moments, a few of the youths began to poke their heads out to look around. "Would someone explain to me what the hell just happened?" the black youth said. He gripped the machine gun tightly, the barrel pointed toward the door in case the soldiers returned. The southern boy rubbed his aching head where he'd been struck by the rifle butt, smearing dark blood on his skin and hands. "Still think this is a prank, hotshot?" The black youth did not answer. There was no need to. Everybody knew it wasn't. A few yards away, Seyfert's head slowly appeared from behind a cabinet and cautiously looked around. His lab was in complete disarray, with glass shattered everywhere and many of the cabinets now sporting bullet holes. For the moment, however, his primary concern wasn't for the machinery. It was for the strange youths who had mysteriously appeared from it. Seifert led the dazed students at a brisk pace down an empty corridor, cautiously scanning for the 20 or so guards he knew would be swarming about the place like angry wasps protecting a nest. They had no time to spare. The youths had already wasted a maddening amount of it. After the skirmish in the lab, he'd practically begged them to follow him to safety. Instead, they had only argued amongst themselves as to whether or not they could trust him. Never in his life had he seen a group of people so quick to squabble, and he couldn't help but wonder if they wouldn't have done so right up until the time more soldiers returned to capture or kill them. It was only when he pointed out that he was the only one not shooting at them that they grudgingly followed. As they went, Seifert was surprised to learn that the youths did not actually know one another. After the generic exchanges of "hey" and "you" had proven confusing and inefficient, he suggested they make rudimentary introductions, beginning with Scott and Michael. They gave their first names, along with a generic description of freshman. Next was the Southern boy, who proudly identified himself as John from Arkansas. The black youth scoffed, saying that only Clintons and Klansmen came from there. What he didn't admit was that he too was from the South, calling Atlanta home. He gave his name as Duane, accompanied by an unspoken challenge for anyone to make something of it. Nobody did. Next was the young female, Tony from Annapolis, who promptly laid out ground rules after Scott made the mistake of holding a door for her. She chastised him for his outdated notion of chivalry and informed everyone in no uncertain terms that she was a liberated woman. If any of them ever treated her to the contrary, she warned, she would not hesitate to kick their ass. John earned yet another glare when he declared her a female of the hairy armpit variety. Following Tony, and looking by far the most distressed of all, was the overweight boy. His name was Bobby from Indianapolis. He still lugged the heavy blue backpack with him, and in between nervous shots from his inhaler, whimpered on about how he should have stayed home to study. His mother would have lunch ready by now, and he just wanted to go home. Next was the skater, Adam, from Phoenix, who, as he held a blood-soaked cloth tightly over his wounded arm, ironically declared himself a pacifist. Fortunately, his injury was not serious, a mere graze that, although throbbing and painful, could easily be remedied. Bringing up the rear was the Hispanic athlete. His name was Ryan, and he had once been a pitcher at the University of Southern California, until an auto accident and a crushed humeral head ended his baseball career. The subsequent loss of his athletic scholarship also put an end to his academic career. He cast cautious glances down the corridor behind them, wishing he hadn't been so quick to discard the machine gun. It had run out of bullets, and it didn't occur to him until much later that he could have probably gotten more off the soldier he'd cold-cocked. The building they were sneaking through was large, old, and surprisingly devoid of people. The halls, all painted an institutionalized gray, were lined with wooden doors. Most were shut and locked, the rooms behind them dark. It was eerily quiet, with the only sounds being the squeaking of the youth's shoes on the polished tiled floors. They occasionally passed an exterior window, but were puzzled to find the glass had been painted black. Scott had to wonder if this was to keep people from seeing in or out. Once, he spotted a framed picture on a wall that showed people in academic robes, and figured the place must have been a school of some type. The small brass plaque read, Classe de fin d'études, 1932. He didn't recognize the language, but suspected it was French. The only thing he knew for certain was that this place was most certainly not the Heinlein College of Science and Technology. They eventually came to a metal door that led to a side stairwell. There they took 3 flights of stairs down to the basement, where Seifert produced a large key that unlocked another, heavier door. This one led to a set of cement stairs that descended into a narrow, arched passageway of red brick that appeared to be a utility corridor. Unlike the pristine building, the tunnel was dark, dirty, and filled with cobwebs. It smelled horribly musty, and the youths stared into it with great apprehension. Scott took out his cell phone, turned on the flashlight, and shone it around inside. Seifert seemed greatly surprised by this and gaped at the device as though he'd never before seen the like. Though all of the students owned a cell phone, only 5 had been in possession of theirs when they decided to investigate Scott's mysterious blue light in the back of the computer lab. Of those 5, only Scott's had survived the recent melee. Tony's had the misfortune of landing on some exposed electrical cabling, and its internal components had been melted and fused into the equivalent of metal oatmeal. Bobby had been distraught to find his cell phone crushed sometime after the shooting started. Likewise, Duane had found his phone bent nearly in half, which prompted John to joke that he was now the proud owner of a flip phone, a comment Duane had not found even slightly amusing. Michael's cell phone had been the real kicker, however. He'd been amazed, and more than just a little horrified, to find a mushroom-shaped bullet lodged in the metal casing. He stared at it in disbelief, with its circuitry exposed like metal guts, abundantly grateful they were not his own. Only Scott's cell phone remained unscathed, though when he went to dial 911, he'd been disheartened to find the no service notification displayed on the screen. Seyfert quickly ushered the youths through the door, but they only began to argue over who should go first. Some voted for Duane, who had the only weapon. Others nominated Scott, who had the only functioning cell phone, and therefore a working flashlight. Scott, tired of all the arguing, reluctantly consented to go first and led them all inside. Once the last youth crossed the threshold, Seyfert relocked the door behind them, the metallic click reverberating off the brick walls with the unsettling finality of a prison door being locked. The group descended the stairs and gathered at the bottom, where they found a long and narrow corridor crammed full of pipes of varying sizes and colors. Most had faded labels with words none of the students recognized: Gaz, Lou, and Eau de Gao. Some of the larger ones were marked Vapor, which needed no translation because of the hot steam that hissed like snakes from pressure relief valves and exuded droplets of water like venom. The resulting heat and humidity were stifling and made them feel as though they were in a sauna. Seyfert once again took the lead and guided the students down the long corridor, which serviced an entire block of buildings and seemed to go on forever. It was dimly lit, with bare bulbs and protective cages spread every 20 yards, creating alternating patches of light and dark. Curtains of cobwebs hung from overhead and had to be swept aside. No one spoke as they shuffled along, either too winded from the humidity or still dazed from all the shooting and excitement. After several minutes, it was Duane who finally broke the silence. "Hey, Bill Nye," he called up to the professor. "Where are you taking us, anyway?" "As far away as possible," Seyfert replied, though he had to wonder who Bill Nye was. The young man only sighed and eyed the professor suspiciously. Being the only African-American in a place full of armed white people dressed up as Nazis, he wasn't exactly prepared to trust anyone. He gripped the machine gun tightly, though he'd been dismayed to learn he'd expended almost all of the ammunition during the firefight. There were only 3 rounds left in the magazine, but he reasoned 3 bullets were better than nothing. "So how do we know you're not a skinhead like those other dudes?" he asked. Seyfert looked confused, but did not stop. "I do not know what a skinhead is, but if you are referring to the soldiers, then yes, they will be searching for you." "So, just to clarify," Scott said, "you're not one of them, right?" Seyfert afforded a quick glance back, slightly insulted. "I am a scientist, not a soldier." "All right, Professor Xavier," Ryan said from the back of the group. "So why were all those vatos dressed up like Nazis anyway?" Seyfert again looked puzzled. "How else would they be dressed?" "Oh, I don't know. Maybe like something not from the History Channel?" Seyfert paused a moment, as though the words had triggered a thought. History? His eyes flicked back and forth rapidly as neurons fired deep behind them, a biological computer processing all the available data. The more he thought, the more furrowed his brow became, as though he were rejecting whatever conclusion his mind was coming to. Finally, he shook his head and sighed, as though he had no choice but to accept the unpalatable conclusion. "Of course," he muttered. "Of course what?" Scott asked. Seyfert turned to look at them, crestfallen. He was hesitant to speak and looked like a man who just discovered a very large mistake, one that he was responsible for making. Then he turned to Scott and spoke softly. "Where did you come from?" "Like I said," Scott said, "D.C." "No," Seyfert said, obviously frustrated. "Let me clarify. From when did you come?" Scott and the others only stared at him silently, as though they were suddenly beginning to question whether following him into a locked and isolated corridor had been such a good idea after all. Scott checked the date on his phone and showed it to him, looking puzzled. "Why do you even need to ask that?" Seyfert closed his eyes, pinched the bridge of his nose, and drew a weary breath. "My God," he whispered. Then he opened his eyes and carefully contemplated his next few statements. "Listen carefully, all of you." The gold loop, or more precisely, the idea behind it, was something Seyfert had been working on for most of his life. He had grown up in a unique time, when, after thousands of years of burning wood, coal, and oil for energy, mankind had finally harnessed the awesome power of electricity. A new age had dawned, and the world was in the process of forever being changed as innovators found ways to put this newfound power to work. It was especially transformational in the field of communication. Beforehand, man had nothing that moved faster than a horse or a locomotive, but things began to zip along at the speed of light as scientific pioneers began to emerge. Samuel Morse and the telegraph, Alexander Bell and the telephone, and Nikola Tesla and the wireless radio. Like an infectious epidemic, each brilliant mind conceived an idea and passed it along to others, who molded it and expounded upon it before passing it along again. The result was a technological renaissance. The improvements weren't without their limitations, however. Telegraphs and telephones required miles of wire to be strung and instantly became useless if a break occurred. Radio was an improvement, but was still limited by distance, line of sight, and environment. Having grown up in a remote area of Austria, Seyfert was well familiar with these factors. His father, a foreman at the Salzfelsen salt mine, once brought home a radio, a great wooden box with dials and tubes that utterly fascinated young Seyfert. He was dismayed to find, however, that thanks to a little pile of rocks called the Austrian Central Alps, the radio could only receive a single station. Seyfert was simply not content with that. He wanted to know the goings-on from all over the world: Paris, London, Rome, Berlin, New York, and 100 other major cities. He dismantled the radio to see how it worked, and more importantly, how it could be improved. When his father found the device in pieces, he was livid. The next day, however, he was shocked to find the radio not only reassembled, but receiving 3 additional stations. It was then he realized that young Seyfert would not be joining him in the salt mines. The boy had a gift. Seyfert's curiosity and unquenchable thirst for knowledge drove him to excel in the fields of science and physics. He eventually became a teacher and moved to Germany, where he rubbed elbows with some of the intellectual masters of the time, picking their minds and trading thoughts and theories. It was through this exchange he would eventually formulate an idea that would allow him to address his childhood frustration with the poor home radio reception. From that germ of thought would eventually blossom the idea that would allow even the weakest of radio signals to be broadcast anywhere across the globe, or even across the galaxy. Although man had yet to foray into the cosmos, scientists as far back as 1916 had already theorized that within the vast void of space there existed certain shortcuts. Future generations would call them wormholes, but they were initially known as Einstein-Rosen bridges, named for Albert Einstein and Nathan Rosen in their 1935 paper. The theory was that these naturally occurring phenomena were like tunnels connecting two faraway points. Unlike black holes, which sucked in everything around them and spit it out the other side, the Einstein-Rosen tunnels were believed to be traversable, meaning matter, or at least energy, could pass back and forth. This thought mesmerized Seyfert. While the technology to put a man into space was still decades away, he believed the bridge idea could be realized on Earth. To open such a connection would be the difference between having to build a railroad around a mountain or tunneling right through it. Most of his peers only scoffed at the notion, saying rock was far easier to manipulate than space. Some even accused him of being mad. Seyfert was not to be dissuaded, however. He genuinely believed his idea would greatly benefit mankind. If he could just open up two minuscule portals, radio waves would be able to pass from one point to another anywhere, with no degradation or interruption at all. He could bridge the gap between every country and continent, regardless of where they were on the globe. A president in the United States could speak directly to a king in Norway. A prime minister in England could communicate with an emir in Kuwait. A radio station in Europe could broadcast to a remote Pacific island. The possibilities and applications were limitless. Sadly, the idea was simply too far-fetched for most to take seriously. Seyfert spent many years trying to convince those with money to invest in his outlandish theory, and while most applauded his good intentions, they believed the goal was simply unobtainable. As a result, he spent most of his adult life seeking in vain for someone who not only believed in his idea, but had the means to realize it. Then, the Second World War broke out. As Germany began its second attempt at mass real estate acquisition in the mid-30s, including Seyfert's own beloved Austria in 1938, Hitler tasked his generals with finding the brightest minds available to aid them in their quest for domination. The Führer wanted scientists to develop something, anything, no matter how far-fetched, that might give the fatherland an advantage over its enemies. Ideas ranged from the plausible to the outrageous, and included such things as a colossal tank standing 5 stories tall, jetpacks, sonic cannons, exploding rats, and even a giant curved mirror that would concentrate the energy of the sun. Each idea, no matter how bizarre, was examined and explored to its fullest potential. So it was that Seyfert's once ridiculed theory finally garnered the attention of someone who was willing to give it a try. The German generals had come knocking on his door, backed by a leader with unlimited funding. After many years, Seyfert finally had his patron. He was, naturally, quite reluctant to do anything to aid the Nazis. Their idea of a utopian society seemed to exclude anyone not of an Aryan pedigree. They proved to be just as persuasive as they were prejudiced, however, and any hesitation Seyfert harbored was squelched when it was suggested that the welfare of his lovely wife and precious 8-year-old daughter would be influenced by his cooperation. In the end, Seyfert had no choice but to work for the Germans. While his idea of unfettered radio communication had been well-intended, the Nazis wanted it for a very different reason. What the good professor had naively failed to realize, and what the Germans had not, was its full potential as an instrument of war. Somewhere along the way, one of his peers made the realization that by punching a hole in space, one was also punching a hole through time. And punching a hole through time, especially one that was viable enough for radio waves to be transmitted through, could lead to the one thing that every military leader craved: the chance to never make a mistake. In most conflicts, intelligence is often the key to victory. Knowing where the enemy is, what they're doing, and where they're going can often be the difference between winning and losing. By 1941, Germany had made plenty of enemies. Having conquered much of Europe, they quickly found there were many nations who did not appreciate their massive land grab. Russia, for instance, was doing its best in the east to reverse Hitler's having moved their border by about 500 kilometers. The threat of retaliation in the west was only somewhat slighter, with the English Channel doing a relatively good job of keeping the British on their islands. Hitler knew, however, that it was only a matter of time before the United States decided to step into the ring. In fact, it was a foregone conclusion. Spies in America were already reporting a large buildup of troops and equipment, most of which were being sent to New York. The entirely wrong side of the continent had their target been Japan. The problem, therefore, wasn't just knowing that an attack was coming, but of simply not knowing when and where. They knew the invasion would have to originate from Britain, but where exactly the Allies would make landfall was anyone's guess. France had 3,427 kilometers of coastline, over 2,000 miles, and Germany did its best to construct a series of defensive fortifications they dubbed the Atlantic Wall. But there was simply no way to effectively protect it all, and the generals could only guess at the most likely landing spots. Most speculated it would be Pas de Calais, where the distance to England was the shortest. If, however, they placed their whole army there only to later learn the invasion was hundreds of miles away, it would be too late. The Allies would have already established a firm foothold before they could reposition their troops. That was where Seyffert's theory became a godsend. If it were possible to punch two holes through time and establish a stable connection, it would theoretically become possible to broadcast radio waves through them. Instead of simply transmitting from one place to another, they could transmit from one time to another. The result would be infallible intelligence. If the Allies landed in a place where Hitler hadn't expected, the Germans need only transmit the information back to themselves so they could correct the position of their armies. The result would be never making a mistake and always making the correct decision. Seyffert had, quite without realizing it, created the ultimate military intelligence device. "It was codenamed Project Mercury," Seyffert said, frowning sadly. "Named for the Greek messenger of the gods." He had to scoff at the implication and shook his head in disgust. "They think themselves gods." The group of young people stared at Seyffert in silent disbelief. Scott sat trying to digest what he'd just been told, suddenly feeling dizzy and even nauseous. If what Seyffert was saying were true, then by getting the gold loop operational, he'd inadvertently ripped a hole in time and space. And if that were so, it meant there'd been a tunnel from the college computer lab to this place. And if the gold loop had been made during World War II, then... Oh, God, he thought, feeling his stomach about to jettison its contents. "So what you're saying," he managed, "is that we're..." He paused, unable to continue, and Seyffert looked at him grimly before finishing his sentence. "You are no longer in Washington, D.C. You are in Paris, and it is 1944.